In the beginning, the gods sacrificed themselves to create the mortal world. Mundus was born, Lorkhan was blamed, and the foundations of existence were laid. But creation wasn't the end of the story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Because after the world was made, reality itself was still unstable. Time did not yet flow as mortals understand it. The gods still walked the newborn world, and the conflict between those who embraced creation and those who saw it as a betrayal would shape everything that came after. This was the Dawn Era. Quick note before we begin, if you haven't watched part 1 of this series yet, I highly recommend going back and watching that first. That video covers the creation of the Elder Scrolls universe, including Anu and Padme, the Orbis, the Etata, Lorkhan's plan, the creation of Mundus, the Aedra and Daedra, Magnus, and the punishment of Lorkhan. A lot of what happens during the Dawn Era directly builds on those events, so part 1 will make everything in this video much easier to follow. If you're already watching it, or have already watched it, let's keep going. What was the Dawn Era? Before we go any further, we need to understand something important. The Dawn Era is not a normal age of history. This is not a period where events happen in a neat, linear order the way they do in later eras. The Dawn Era is the mythic age that followed the creation of Mundus. The mortal world existed, but reality had not fully settled. Time was not yet stable. The laws of existence were still being established. The gods and original spirits were still deeply involved in the shaping of the world. So when we talk about the Dawn Era, we're talking about a period that exists somewhere between creation, mythology, and history, a time when the world was real, but not yet fixed. And because of that, Elder Scrolls lore doesn't always present the Dawn Era as one single, perfectly agreed upon sequence of events. Like much of Elder Scrolls mythology, different cultures remember it differently, but at the center of all these stories is one truth. The world had been created, and now, the gods had to live with the consequences. The Ehlnofey. Among the most important beings of this age were the Ehlnofey. The exact meaning of that word changes depending on which source you read, but for our purposes, the Ehlnofey are ancient beings tied closely to the original spirits and to the earliest ancestry of mortal peoples. In other words, if the Etata were the original divine beings of creation, the Ehlnofey stand closer to the beginning of mortal life on Nirn. And this is where one of the most important divisions in Elder Scrolls mythology begins, because the Ehlnofey did not remain united. According to one major creation tradition, there came to be two groups, the Old Ehlnofey and the Wandering Ehlnofey. The Old Ehlnofey were those who preserved more of their ancient nature. They remained tied to a more stable remnant of the old world. They clung to what had been. The Wandering Ehlnofey, on the other hand, were scattered across the changed and broken world. They wandered, they struggled, they adapted to harsh, new conditions. So the simplest way to understand this split is this. The Old Ehlnofey preserved the world as it was. The Wandering Ehlnofey adapted to the world that they had created. And from this division, the seeds of one of the greatest conflicts in Elder Scrolls history was planted. The beginning of Men and Mer. The divide between the Old and Wandering Ehlnofey is important for one massive reason. It becomes one of the mythological explanations for the origins of Mer and Men. The Old Ehlnofey are strongly associated with the ancestors of the Elves. The Wandering Ehlnofey are strongly associated with the ancestors of mankind. And immediately, this helps explain a pattern we already started to see in the creation story. Many Elven traditions view the creation of Mundus as a loss. Their ancestors were closer to the divine. Creation diminished them. Mortality separated them from the state they once enjoyed. From that perspective, Lorkhan was not a hero at all. He was the architect of a terrible fall. Human traditions often view things very differently. Rather than seeing the mortal world as a prison or a curse, many human cultures embrace mortal life as something meaningful, something worth defending, something worth fighting for. And because Lorkhan made mortal existence possible, he is often remembered far more positively in human tradition than he is in Elven belief. So the divide between Men and Mer is not just racial, it is philosophical, it is spiritual. It reaches all the way back to the beginning of the world itself. Was creation a tragedy, or was it an opportunity? That question lies at the heart of the Dawn Era. The War of the Ehlnofey. Eventually, the wandering Ehlnofey found their way back to the lands of the old Ehlnofey, and what should have been a reunion became a disaster. The wanderers had changed. The old Ehlnofey looked upon them as lesser, diminished, or corrupted from what they had been once. Hostility grew, and that hostility turned into a war. Not a normal war, not a simple clash of armies. This was a mythic conflict fought in the earliest age of the world, among beings still much closer to the divine than any later mortal race. The war between the old and the wandering Ehlnofey is said to have been so vast and destructive that it reshaped the very face of Nirn. Lands were broken, seas were formed, the world itself was altered by the violence of the struggle, and behind this conflict, we can see the deeper divide taking shape. On one side, the forces associated with preservation, memory, and the lost divine state. On the other, the forces associated with adaptation, mortality, and the harsh but meaningful reality of the new world. And in mythic terms, those two worldviews become personified by two of the most important beings in all of Elder Scrolls lore, Auri-El and Lorkhan. Auri-El, the elven form of the time god, stands as one of the great divine ancestors of Mer, or elves. He represents order, legitimacy, and the memory of what existed before the mortal world's fall into limitation. Lorkhan, meanwhile, is the one who proposed the creation of Mundus. To many elves, he is the deceiver responsible for their suffering. To many men, he is the being who made their existence possible. And so in the Dawn era, these two figures stand at the center of a cosmic conflict, not simply as individuals, but as symbols of two visions of the world. Was mortality an unforgivable loss, or the beginning of something worth becoming? These aren't just theological disagreements, they become the foundation of the struggle between Men and Mer. And in the stories of this age, that struggle leads to one of the most important events in the entire mythology of Elder Scrolls, because Auri-El did not stand alone, he had a champion. That champion was Trinimac. Among the early elven spirits, Trinimac is remembered as one of the greatest warriors of the age, a mighty defender of the old order, the sword arm of Auri-El. If Auri-El represented the authority of the elven gods, Trinimac represented their strength, their will, their refusal to accept what Lorkhan had done to that world. And in the stories told by the elves, it is Trinimac who finally confronts Lorkhan. It is Trinimac who defeats him, and it is Trinimac who tears out Lorkhan's heart. This is the same heart that would later become one of the most important objects in all of Elder Scrolls history, the heart that could not be destroyed, the heart that would eventually come to rest beneath Red Mountain. So, once again, we see something important about Elder Scrolls mythology. The events of creation do not remain distant myth, they continue echoing through every age that follows. But even Lorkhan's defeat was not the true end of the Dawn era, because the world itself was still unstable, reality still needed to be fixed. And that brings us to one of the single most important places in all of Elder Scrolls lore. Adamantine Tower. On an island off the coast of Tamriel stands a structure of enormous importance, Adamantine Tower, also called Adamantia. In later tower lore, Adamantine Tower is understood as the first great stable point of reality in the chaotic dawn, the first spike driven into a world that had not yet fully settled, and that image is a useful one, because this is exactly what the Dawn era was like, a world still moving, still shifting, still unstable. A world where reality itself had not fully agreed on its own rules. Adamantine Tower changed that. It became the place where permanence could begin, the place where events could be fixed, the place where myth started becoming history. And at Adamantine Tower, the gods gathered for one of the most important events in Elder Scrolls cosmology, the Convention. The Convention is the great divine gathering associated with the judgment of Lorkhan and the stabilization of the world. This is where the consequences of creation are confronted. This is where the aftermath of Mundus is decided, and this is where the world begins to move away from the chaos of the dawn. Different traditions remember this pretty differently. As always in the Elder Scrolls lore, there is no single clean version agreed upon by every race. But in broad terms, Convention is where the divine conflict surrounding creation becomes fixed into the structure of reality. Lorkhan's punishment belongs to the mythic setting. His heart is separated from him. The fate of the mortal world is sealed, and through Adamantine Tower, the unstable world begins to settle into something more permanent. In a sense, convention is not just a judgment, it is a turning point. Before convention, the world is mythic, fluid, and uncertain. After convention, the foundations of ordinary history began to emerge. This is the moment where the Dawn Era starts giving way to a world mortals can actually inhabit. This leads into the end of the Dawn Era, and that is what makes the Dawn Era so important. It is not simply the age after creation. It is the age in which the consequences of creation are fought over, judged, and ultimately fixed into the world. It is the age of the Ehlnofey, the age of the ancient divide between Men and Mer, the age of Auri-El, Lorkhan, and Trinimac, the age of Adamantine Tower, and the age of convention. And when that age finally comes to an end, the world enters a new chapter, the Merithic Era. The era of the Elves, a time still ancient and mysterious, but one much closer to recognizable history than the chaos that came before. So if episode 1 was about the creation of the world, then the Dawn Era is about what happened when the new world had become real. The gods had made Mundus, now reality had to hold, and from that struggle, the future of Tamriel was born. The Dawn Era is one of the strangest periods in all of Elder Scrolls lore. A world without stable time, a mythic war between ancient ancestors, a divine conflict over whether creation itself was a blessing or a curse, and in the middle of all of it, the first steps from myth into history. But even after the Dawn Era ends, Tamriel is still far from the world we know in the games. The elves rise, ancient civilizations spread, and the foundations of later history begin to take shape. So next, we move into the Merithic Era, and into the earliest true ages of Tamriel. The story is only getting started.